Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining this special event and three-part series with our partner Deloitte Private, where we'll be talking about how to thrive in the new business landscape. Firstly, I hope you and your loved ones are keeping well during what has been a challenging few months and weeks for so many. I'm Juliet Scott-Croxford, CEO at Worth Media, your moderator for today, and I'm delighted to be joined by special guest Phil Colosso, CEO of Deloitte Corporate Finance, and David Seamus, founding partner and chief investment officer at Atlas Merchant Capital. Hi, David and Phil.
Hey, Julia. Nice to see you, Julia.
So just before we get started, many of us have been impacted from a business standpoint over the past few months. And as businesses look to reset into a new normal, Worth with Deloitte Private are examining the M&A trends and opportunities that have emerged for businesses in the short, medium, and long term. This session is specifically looking at how trends will impact privately owned businesses and how those businesses can utilize these opportunities to not only recover, but also to thrive. Our intention at Worth is to create these conversations to help inspire and inform our community, many of whom are on this event and are investors or private business owners. So with topics like this, we really want to help inform and inspire you, and we hope you find it useful. And we're bringing in different thought leaders and experts throughout this series. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. This is a conversation and we welcome questions from you. Attendees are muted on entry into this session. However, if you use the chat function at the bottom of your screen and type in a question directly to me, Juliet Scott-Croxford, I can either unmute you so you can ask that question to the speakers directly, or we'll weave it into the conversation as we go if you'd prefer to stay anonymous. So let's get started. Thriving in the new business landscape and how the pandemic has impacted mergers and acquisitions specifically. I'd like to just start with a personal check-in with you both. How are you doing personally? How have you been managing your own well-being during these unusual times? Phil, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Juliet. And appreciate everybody joining, and thanks to Worth Media for having me and us. Doing okay. This is the longest in my professional career I think I have been not on a plane. And also, as people can say, I haven't shaved either. But doing well. I have 3 kids. I have a 19-year-old daughter, a 16-year-old daughter, and a 12-year-old son. Ripping my 19-year-old out of college for freshman year and locking her in her house with her siblings and her parents for 12 weeks is not a recipe for happiness. But she has been great. And we're doing fine. We are very, very lucky. We're healthy. And most importantly, my wife celebrates her 50th birthday on Thursday. So that's going to be the highlight of our summer. So, but we're doing great.
Thank you. And David, how about you? I know you're in your basement.
Yeah, no, I'm sitting in my basement for the last number of months, which, I have to say my whole feeling about this lockdown we've all been living through, at least from my point of view, is it's been better than anyone could have expected, I think, both from a professional point of view and a personal point of view. Happily, everyone's healthy. I have 3 kids also. They're all home, killing each other. My son was away at school, but now he's back. But so on one hand, it's been better than we all could have expected, I think, both professionally and personally. But it still hasn't been great. Sitting in my basement for 4 months or whatever it's been, trying to get stuff done, and things do get done, and we're going to get into that, I think, as part of this discussion. But it's harder than normal. It takes slower than normal. It's better than expected, but still not great. That's my tagline for the day.
Thank you. And we will get into that and some of the challenges that you've experienced and others are experiencing. So, Phil, can you just tell us a bit about your professional background and work surrounding the M&A space and Deloitte Private's general approach to mergers and acquisitions?
Yeah, so I've been in the investment banking world my entire career, basically been predominantly a sell-side M&A practitioner for 22 years. Most significantly, I co-founded an investment bank in 2001 with a gentleman named Hugh McCall, who was the former CEO of Bank of America. We were based in Charlotte, started with 6 of us in a 12-year period, grew it to about 100 of us nationwide, had an office in Dallas, in Los Angeles, in Atlanta, And then in 2013, Mr. McCall was finally ready to actually retire. And so we took our own advice. We hired an investment bank. We ran a process, and we're fortunate enough to partner with Deloitte. So I've been at Deloitte 7 years. I now, for the last 4 years, have run the U.S. investment bank. And I also, for the last 2 years, have run the global investment bank. And our focus, which I think is what's such a good fit with Worth and with this audience group, is that we are the most active investment bank. Well, first of all, we're the most active investment bank in the world, which most people don't know. We did 540 transactions last year. But more importantly for this conversation, we are by far the most active investment bank focused on private and entrepreneurially owned businesses. That's what we do. That's what we love. We love the ups and downs and backs and forths of working with entrepreneurs. We are entrepreneurs, and that's why we get out of bed every day. So love what we do. Got a great team, and excited to push this conversation.
That's great. And David, you've had significant experience in investing in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia, including transactions and sourcing execution. Can you share a bit about your journey and the overarching thesis for Atlas?
Sure. I started the mid-90s after college at a firm that doesn't exist anymore called Salomon Brothers. I'm sure some people on the phone remember that. But I was doing financial services M&A in the investment bank from the beginning. I spent 5 years there. I was 25 years old when I was staffed on some crazy idea to help 2 Americans try to buy a Japanese bank, which at the time seemed like a ridiculous idea, and no one thought it would happen. So they'll let the 25-year-old guy run around Tokyo for a year. I did that. That deal actually got done. That was Tim Collins from Ripplewood and Chris Flowers, who had just left Goldman Sachs. A couple months after the deal closed, Chris hired me to be the #1 employee, the first employee at the newly formed J.C. Flowers & Co. We did private equity investing in financial services for almost 15 years. I got to know Bob Diamond, the former CEO of Barclays, after he left Barclays. We spent about a year getting to know each other, deciding if we thought we were right for each other, and also deciding if we thought the world needed another financial services focused private equity style investor. We decided the answer to both those questions was yes. And a little over 5 years ago or so, we founded, actually 6 years ago, we founded Atlas Merchant Capital, doing exactly that. Today, we have a private equity style fund. We also have a hedge fund that does mostly credit type opportunities. And we're often looking for new verticals as time marches on.
Which is great. And just so you have offices in London and in New York, right?
Yeah, we have offices in London and New York. We think that's the right footprint for us. Though, to your point earlier, over my career, I've done deals in North America, Europe, South America, and Asia. We look at things, our focus these days is really the US, Canada, and Western Europe. And we define Western Europe as any country that does business in the euro. And plus the UK, of course. But we would look at things outside of that if we thought we had a really strong argument and probably a pretty good partner to work with.
And how is the portfolio structured? I think you shared earlier, you've sort of focused on investments in certain areas. Can you share about what those are?
Yeah. So in the private equity fund, it is all financial services. It is mostly what I'd call sort of highly regulated companies. Our basic thesis is that when you get into the regulated businesses, banks, insurance companies, broker-dealers, there is less competition because a lot of other private equity investors don't like fooling around with highly regulated businesses. And there's actually more opportunity because these are often the big businesses, big companies that require a lot of capital. And we all know what's happened during and since the financial crisis. That my little world is far from recovered from the financial crisis, even though a lot of, most of the world is. We do things outside of that. One of our 8 companies in our first fund, I would sort of consider a normal leverage buyout that a lot of other people do. But for us, it's the exception, not the rule. And then in our hedge fund, it's much more traditional. Any type of company and any type of corporate credit, we think there's an opportunity in. And when we look at our sort of additional verticals, we're adding credit being the first. We kind of look at the left side of a bank's balance sheet, corporate credit, real estate, maybe some sort of venture is how we see our future.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say welcome to a few people that have just joined. We're here talking about how the pandemic has impacted mergers and acquisitions. Phil, so let's just sort of take a step back. What's the current environment like for private company leaders contemplating a sale or a merger, and how has that changed pre-COVID, based on the conversations that you've been having with clients?
Yeah, what's interesting about it is, first, walking into this crisis, sort of going back to January, businesses were performing really well. There was a lot of things to like about the environment in which businesses were operating. Low interest rates, pretty good economy, relatively stable sort of regulatory environment, a lot of cross-border activity, which was driving, a lot of M&A. So, businesses were performing well, were growing well. Although ironically, M&A in volume had actually declined both in 2018 and 2019 slightly, but it was still a very, very good environment for business owners. That being said, obviously everything started changing in March, and what we found over the period is in the first probably 4 to 6 weeks, there was just this period of intense internal focus. So if you go back to sort of the end of February, we had about 100 and just round numbers, say 100 deals that we were working on, 20 of which were kind of toward the closing end and 80 of which were sort of in the middle. And basically what we said is, for the 20 that are about to close, let's focus on those and keep going. For the 80 that are, mid to earlier stage, let's wait. And so again, for the first 4 to 6 weeks, I think every business owner was just trying to take stock of what was going to happen with a variety of different components of their business, how they were going to work with their employees virtually, how they were going to keep their employees safe, how they were going to interact with their customers. One thing that I'm sure will come up again is how their supply chain was going to react, because a lot of our clients have supply chain exposure to Asia. And so when Asia shut down, and that was a leading indicator, that really threw a lot of our clients for loops. I would say over the last 4 to 6 weeks after that, it's actually been a really interesting time. I think there are a number of companies that have done fine, and many have excelled during the pandemic. And we'll talk about which companies those are and types of industries. There are some that are still in kind of trying to figure it out mode. A lot of our clients got funding from the government through the PPP and CARES process, and that was really well timed and I thought very useful and valuable to them. So, where we are today is the markets are just starting to open up. I would say our clients in general have had a more positive than expected experience with their employees working virtually. They've had a more positive than expected engagement with their customers. I think there's still a lot of anxiety about supply chain. There's still a lot of anxiety about forecasting the remainder of 2020. And so there's a lot of things going on. It's been a really busy 3 months.
And you touched on this around sort of certain industries and sectors seeing more progress than others. During the sort of the last few months, have you seen certain industries that have been able to make more progress on deals than others during this time?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say on the bad side, I think companies in the hospitality industry, in the oil and gas industry, are still really struggling. Parts of financial services, although financial services has generally been a good sector, and I'm sure David can talk about that. I'd say the sectors that are doing well are tech-enabled services are doing really well. Telemedicine, within the healthcare space, telemedicine, healthcare IT is doing really well. I'd say any businesses that serve online, food supplies, fulfillment, e-commerce, those businesses are performing really well. But then some other ones you might not think about. One that's been really interesting because of the inflection is packaging. So, a lot of packaging companies have Asian supply chains. So for February and March, they were in lockdown waiting for the supply chain to open up. But then since that's happened, especially companies that supply packaging into food or sort of essential goods, those businesses are doing really well right now. And a lot of them are going to end up higher for 2020 than they originally expected. So it's been, there's certainly a lot of dichotomy. I'd say my general theme is that what this pandemic has done is it has accelerated trends that were already happening in most businesses, and the level of disruption that a lot of business owners expected just from normal course has been sped up dramatically. And a lot of business owners are having to figure out how to exist in that market, and then working with us are figuring out how to be participate in M&A.
And David, from your point of view, have you seen specific trends on industries that have managed to progress deals more than others?
Well, I spend almost all my time in financial services, so we certainly see a lot. I would say answer that a couple ways. Firstly, when I think about a crisis, I think about living through the financial crisis of 08 and 09 that we all lived through. And from my point of view, in the financial services business, it was, every day some new problem. Every day, whether it was a problem in a company we were looking at, whether it was a problem in a company we owned, it was quite amazing. But also, whether it's right or wrong, and we don't have to debate this now, but the world sort of blamed it all on the financial services industry. So we were sort of taking fire from all sides, and it was very tough. This is very different in what we do. I don't think anyone's blaming anyone in particular. This is obviously not a man-made crisis we have here. So what that does is, first of all, it makes it a lot easier to operate your business, but also, more importantly, it makes it a whole lot easier politically for the government to do what it needs to do to help the situation out. We all knew in the last crisis what needed to be done was putting capital into banks. That was the right answer, but oh my God, actually doing it was a very politically difficult thing to do. We're not seeing that here. That's not the dynamic we're going through. And then I think, within financial services, and Phil touched on this, but we have, both in our own portfolio and what we're seeing out there, some businesses are doing really well. Some businesses, frankly, are thriving in this environment. I don't think anybody might have predicted it before. We all know that sort of Google and Facebook are doing great because everyone's sitting home in front of their computers. But, we own three broker dealers, one in the US, two in Europe. They're all doing great, way better than any budgets expected or anyone sort of would expect it with 90+% of their employees sitting at home every day. So it's the impact on this, again, the last crisis, it was sort of simple. It was bad for everybody, and it was just a question of how bad was it for you. This crisis, it's bad for some. It's sort of neutral for others, and it's actually quite good for others. And you don't feel great saying it's quite good because it's a terrible human crisis we're going through right now. But from a business point of view, it's definitely a wide range. I don't want to talk too long here, but from an M&A point of view, and we'll get into this a little more, we haven't seen a lot. We've seen some, but at least in the beginning, certainly in the beginning, and Phil touched on this, business owners have a lot of other things to worry about besides selling their company. That's sort of point one. And point two, even now, and I think this is starting to change, and I think we're gonna peel this onion a little more as we keep talking. But as a seller, people are gonna wonder why you're selling now, of all times. And if I'm a seller of something, I'm trying to, thinking, is this really the best time to be selling? And as a buyer of things, I'm involved in a few things right now. I just got off a long diligence call with a management team. As a buyer, you're going to be skeptical as to, why is this guy selling right now? Is this really the best time? Are they that desperate? Maybe we can get a better price because of that, et cetera.
Yeah, Juliet, one last thing I'd say, because I think it's a pretty funny anecdote, is I saw this, I think this is still true, but it was definitely true a week ago, that the market cap of Zoom, the company that hosts these webcasts, is actually higher than the collective market cap of all the US-based airlines. So if you ever want a statement like to define the winners and the losers, at least so far, I think that's pretty telling.
It's extraordinary. And David, what advice have you been giving sellers during this time? I know it's not obviously one size fits all. And how are you sort of seeing the current context as an investor?
Yeah, well, I'm not in the advisory business per se, so I'm not talking to 100 sellers. On the other hand, we own a number of companies, one of which, and I'm not going to mention any names, but one of which we had been preparing for a sale process sort of going into 2020. Two things have happened in 2020 so far. One is, from an operating and financial point of view, the company is doing better than we could have possibly expected. I think we hit our full year budget on earnings in like mid-March, which was pretty good. We're already more than double that. So on one hand, that's great. On the other hand, we have done a fair amount in the background to get prepared for a sale, hiring an investment banker, doing a lot of the work you need to do, preparing documents, preparing data rooms and that sort of stuff. But we have not yet sort of gone out to the rest of the world because we do worry a lot that just saying we're thinking about doing a sale right now, people are going to say, what's wrong? What's the matter? Why would you sell right now? Now, as time goes on, there'll be less and less of that. And as time goes on, there'll be more deals. And, I really hope we're not all sitting here in a year in our basements. But if we are sitting here in a year in our basements, we'll all adjust to this and those issues will go away. But forget about what I'm advising other people. What I'm doing myself for our own companies is one live example is we're getting a lot of the legwork done. So whenever we think it's time to launch, we can launch. But at the moment, our criteria is until I can have a meeting in New York City with other human beings without wearing, personal protective equipment, it's really hard to want to launch that process. I might change, my opinion might change on that. I'm not saying that we'll never change that position, but at the moment, that's how I feel about it.
Phil?
Yeah, so I mean, first, I'd say sellers sell for a lot of reasons which aren't just financial, right? A lot of times sellers sell because they've reached retirement age, they've hit the number that they're ready to, they can make the number that they need to make to step away. They have a health problem, a spouse that gets sick. It turns out one of their sons or daughters can't run the business the way they expected. They get approached by a buyer. There's tax rules change. I mean, we have a number of clients that are worried that if the Democrats win if Biden wins, that tax rates might go up, capital gains tax rates might go up. So there's a lot of reasons that sellers sell, which are not just because of the absolute peak of multiples. That being said, what's interesting about this market, and David sort of referenced it, is there's been a bit of a dichotomy. And I think, if you are in what I'll call a more distressed industry, I don't think it's necessarily time to sell. But if you're in a business that's performing well, and that one of the adjectives we're using right now is forecastable, we are finding that buyers and private equity groups are very focused on helping and working with our clients to figure out what does a forecast look like for the rest of this year and going into next year. And if you are able to do that for your business in a credible way, you could still get a very, very high multiple for your business. For example, we sold a chain of veterinary clinics in March, and it was a white hot process. Sold it to a private equity group for teen multiples as the world was sort of coming apart. And so deals are still happening. And again, good businesses have got good multiples, will continue to get good multiples. But what you have to do as an advisor is be prepared. And David referenced this: get your client prepared so that when the window opens, you're ready to go. Because again, I think the global financial crisis in 2009 scared a lot of people, especially entrepreneurs. I think this event is going to scare some people into saying, I may not have 5 more years to deal with this. And what we found in 2009 was the volume of M&A took sort of a U-shaped curve. Took about 5 years to get back, but the multiples actually took more of a V-shaped curve, where the multiples actually rebounded reasonably quickly. It's just the volume took longer to get back.
And we do, I've got a few more questions where I want to go to the audience because there's a couple of questions there. We talked about the practical challenges a little bit. We've touched on those just around deal making during this time and the inability to meet people in person and visit companies. What changes have you both seen in terms of deal structure and financing for sales during this period?
Yeah, I'll go first. I mean, I think a few things. I ask everybody that I talk to, especially in the private equity community, because we sell a lot of businesses to private equity, would you ever close a deal where you never physically went to the company or met the management team in person? And I think maybe with one exception on, call it 50 conversations, the answer's been no. So I think we're all being unrealistic. I'm not saying it won't happen, but I think it's very unrealistic to think that, people that are fiduciary stewards of other people's money are going to close a transaction where they haven't actually physically been with the owners or the company and done tours and those kinds of things. So I think that's unrealistic. There's lots of ways that people are trying to figure out, driving instead of flying, doing things like this sort of in pieces instead of big, 20-person groups in a conference room. In terms of deal structure, I do think we're seeing a lot of changes. Earnouts, deferred compensation tied to next year's budget, those kinds of things. But again, I would just say there's a lot of good businesses are going to trade for good multiples. And I just firmly believe that, we're probably, this week was a really good week. Last week was a good week. People are getting on planes again. I think like David said, if we get late in the summer, early in the fall, I think we're going to have a very robust M&A market again for good businesses that are performing well.
And what about due diligence? Can you even do proper due diligence in this climate?
David, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I actually think Phil's point about sort of the sort of soft part of it is a lot harder during this time. In other words, meeting the management team, meeting the founders, having dinner, talking about the world, talking about how they see their business. That is really hard to do right now. Doing formal diligence is really not that hard at all. It's been a long time since a data room was actually a room. So even before coronavirus and when we were able to get on planes all the time, a lot of diligence was done from a desktop anyway. So we're in the middle of a deal right now. The timing on this had worked out pretty well, but we're in a deal right now where we had already known the management team of the company, and it's a private company, so similar to the sort of dynamic here, but it was a private company. We already knew the management team for a number of years. We re-engaged with them sort of the second half of 2019, spent a fair amount of time with them doing all that soft stuff. And literally coincidentally, it was sort of February, March where we geared up to do the diligence. And we really, shot the gun on that a week or two before coronavirus started. It probably took a little longer than it normally would, but not that much longer. And we have, 4 different diligence reports from 4 different providers going around to ourselves and to a few of our co-investors. So that part was super effective. And that's an example where we got lucky. So I think, the part Phil mentioned earlier, this sort of soft part is really hard right now. The harder part of diligence, when I say hard, I don't mean difficult, but I mean the sort of more quantitative and less qualitative parts are actually getting done, I think, pretty well and pretty effectively.
Yeah, and one other point I just make, separate from the diligence point, but a difference compared to 2009 is, private equity is an amazing phenomenon. It's been the highest performing asset class, and certainly in the last 10 years, probably the last 20 years. It's interesting if you go back 20 years and take the number of public companies in the United States, the numbers basically will be cut in half in 20 years, but it's been replaced by private equity owned companies. And so the numbers are almost identical in total. But what's interesting is if you compare today versus 2009, the dollars invested in private equity funds like David's is double what it was in 2009. And the reason that matters, and the reason I bring that up, is that gives us as sell-side advisors a lot of confidence that there's going to be sufficient capital to make investments in great businesses and pay competitive multiples in great businesses, because private equity has emerged as a very, very reasonable, and in many cases, a premium to strategic buyers. It used to be for years and years and years and years that if you wanted to get a premium multiple, you had to go to your biggest competitor. There was tons of synergies. They were going to fire a bunch of people. their cost of capital was low, and that was the way you optimized price. And maybe even if that buyer was foreign, that was even better. What we found in the last, really in the last 5 years, is that private equity groups will pay competitively. They understand, that they need to win. And they'll, so all of a sudden you have this sort of end market that is emerging and has been just as competitive and often, better partners for our types of clients, because a lot of times our clients are looking for, a next stage. They've never had institutional capital. They've never had a board structure. They've never had a sophisticated capital provider advising them. And they partner with someone like David, who can take a business that's doing really well right now, but triple or quadruple the business just through some strategic insights, some access to resources. And so my big point is knowing that private equity is now available in twice the volume it was 10 years ago makes us feel like the M&A market's more likely to bounce back fast as opposed to dragging out for a while.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Phil. You mentioned the sort of the private sale alternative versus a strategic. You didn't mention the other option, which of course is an IPO. And back to your point about how the number of public companies. I always say that every CEO I know wants to be the CEO of a public company, other than every CEO of a public company, because it's sort of like people dream that's sort of the pinnacle that they want to get to, and then once they get to it, they realize. It's not like, again, we keep this in perspective, right? Being a CEO of a public company is better than, most people's lives and jobs. But on the other hand, the amount of time they spend doing things where they would sort of qualify it as something not advancing their business is a lot. And then the amount of expense you have between Sarbanes-Oxley and all the other things you have to do to be a public company, it's just there's sort of cost both in time and in money that they realize maybe that wasn't such a great idea. So, we own a company now. Again, I won't mention any names, but it's a company I've been involved with for a long time. So if anyone wanted to figure it out, it wouldn't be that hard. And, they've been talking, they meaning the management team, been talking about doing an IPO for over 10 years. And it's sort of never the right time. And there's always better things to do. And we've been doing those better things all along.
I want to go to a couple of the questions. There's one from Robert Wolf. Robert, if you're there, just around some of the factors that make a company's business more predictable.
Yeah. Phil was actually talking about the nuances of the businesses and some that will do well from a predictability on the model standpoint. I was just sort of curious what he sees is what makes somebody unique where you'll be able to predict the future versus somebody where you may not be able to predict the future.
Yeah, and listen, our business, the investment banking business, is incredibly unpredictable. So I have a deep respect for people that cannot project their businesses at all, because my business is really hard to project. But I would say, the attributes that are more valuable in this context are, what we call subscription-based businesses or SaaS. It seems like everyone's now a SaaS business of some kind. There's all these acronyms. There's infrastructure as a service, which is IaaS, and there's disaster recovery as a service, which is DRaaS, and there's everything is as a service. I think there's like SOX as a service probably somewhere. So every but if you have a recurring subscription-based model where people typically are opting in to continuing that subscription on a monthly basis, that's huge. That makes a big difference in predictability. I'd say secondly, if you have customer diversification, it used to be that the only thing worse than having Walmart as a customer was not having Walmart as a customer. But in this day and age, if you have customer diversity where you don't have to depend on one specific customer and they could change their decision, and all of a sudden you've lost 20 or 30% of your business, customer diversification helps a lot with that. So I'd say it's a lot of it's end markets. Again, oil and gas is suffering right now. Aerospace is suffering right now. Hospitality is suffering right now. So if you have visibility into the spending patterns of your end market or your end user, that typically is what people are looking for. And a lot of it honestly comes to, in a lot of these deals we work on, there is a third-party financing element to it, either a bank or a mezzanine lender or somebody like that. And obviously banks want to see predictability of cash flows. And so we work really hard with our clients to make sure that we've built good models, thinking through all the demand drivers. And one interesting subtle point, which is really subtle, but we're just starting to see it now, is it seemed like, things were pretty quiet for the last few weeks, picking up now. But I would say, and David may disagree with this, but I would say most buyers right now are giving most of the companies kind of a pass for 2020. Everyone's sort of in disarray. I think where people are really drilling in right now on the buyer side is, what is 2021 going to look like? And how predictable and how forecastable is your 2021, which I know is really hard for any of us to say. But the more visibility you have into that, I think that's where you can really drive a premium outcome.
Yeah, I would say, listen, I agree with all that. I would say, anyone who's in the private equity business for a long time, even the bosses that are running companies, they probably started back in the day, as Excel jockeys, building Excel models and staying in the office all night. I know I did. And, people that grew up on Excel, they love building models, or they like having other people build models for them. And the advice I'd give a seller or a private business owner that wants to sell is the easier you can make it for someone to do those forecasts themselves and to understand what the drivers are, the happier they're going to be. And, particularly entrepreneurs and people that start their own businesses, or even people that are running businesses that are not necessarily public, or that a small number of people might own large percentage of it. They're out there fighting the fight every day, and they're not necessarily thinking about big assumptions that drive their business. But my advice would be to try to, if you're sitting across the table from someone in private equity and you say, well, my business is all about, the number of people that go to movies times, the percentage of those people that like eating ice cream, and the ones who, wear blue shirts on Thursdays. I don't mean to give a ridiculous suggestion, but my point is the ability to sort of tie those things together and let them have their own opinion on the number of people that wear blue shirts on Thursdays, and they can run their own models and sensitize that, is what the sort of industry loves, and what Excel jockeys love doing. And I think, the best advice, I think, is giving people like that, or people like us, I should say, the tools to be able to do that is very valuable when you're trying to sell a company and maximize the value.
Well, and also, every owner has different priorities. I have a very funny story. It's an older deal, but I had a client in the healthcare training industry. She had built a business from scratch. It was, round numbers, call it, 10 million of EBITDA. She said to us when we pitched the business, she said, the most important thing for me is price. And I said, of course, we think your business is probably worth, 10 times EBITDA. And she said, but the second most important thing is our Christmas party. And I said, okay, tell me about that. And she had about 25 employees. And she said, every year around Christmas, we charter a plane, we fly our entire workforce to Vegas. We do an all expenses paid trip for 4 days. And, it is the most important thing we do for culture. And I said, okay, I got it. So she said, any buyer we have has to honor that Christmas party, period. I need it in writing, in perpetuity. And I said, okay, well, how much does that cost you? And she said, it costs about $100,000 a year. I said, wow, okay. I said, let me just walk through this with you. There's a chance that if I push this hard, I can get you that Christmas party in writing for a couple of years, maybe, depends on who it is. Or we can add that Christmas party back, $100,000 back into your P&L, and I can get you 10 times that, and I can get you an extra $1 million of proceeds. And it's your choice. I'm happy to do either one. I just want to give you options. You pick. And of course, she thought about it, and she said, I'll take the $1 million.
I got to say, that's an interesting story. And I if I was her advisor, I would actually lay it on even thicker. It's not just $1 million. I think that as a buyer, if I had someone say that to me and do something that I thought was just irrational, like, want me to do something like that, if it's the right thing to do, if it's the right thing for the business, I'll be convinced. I can spend $100,000 on a company that's making $10 million a year. That's probably, if it's the right thing to do, let's just do it. But if a buyer is forcing me to, no one likes to be forced to do anything, right? It's human nature to react the opposite direction when someone forces you to do something. And if if the seller is forcing me to do that contractually, which I'm not even sure how she can if she no longer owns the business, But anyway, I would worry, oh my God, what other irrational decisions like that has she been making along the way here? And that would either cause me to have to do, sharpen my pencil and do even more diligence and figure out what am I missing. Or it's going to make me say, you know what, I'm need to be a little more risk averse here. And, I thought I had a 20% discount rate here, but now I need a 22.5% discount rate. And that right there will cost her more than $1 million. So, being thoughtful and rational is what private equity guys think of themselves. Whether that's true or not is a different, but they're going to be turned off by things like that.
I want to just touch on the situation that we're now in and M&A activity, shift of how companies are perceiving M&A activity, because I think during this time, some are seeing it as a mode of survival, or it's the only way that they can pivot their brand or their business to ensure sustainable growth. And I'm sort of looking at retail and the likes of DBF and the retail space. What's your view on that, Phil, in terms of sort of certain sectors having to enter into these conversations to get to survive?
Yeah, no, it's like we're dancing, Juliet. I was thinking exactly, I was going to go that direction. So I think the way we characterize it within Deloitte, within our M&A group, is there's defensive M&A and there's offensive M&A. So I think the example you cited is more defensive M&A, when you're really trying to make sure your business survives. And so you are worried about liquidity, you're worried about your making payroll, you're worried about, things are, I don't want to say on fire, but things are getting, drastic, and you really don't have any other choice. And the best way to sustain your business or get some benefit and liquidity for it is an M&A process. And there are examples of that. Again, hospitality, oil and gas, there's some stuff in the healthcare industry which would fall in that category. So there's definitely some defensive M&A. But there's also a lot of offensive M&A where people are saying, it's interesting, if you go back to the crisis, if you look at people that made acquisitions in the 2 or 3 years after 2009 from a private equity perspective, their returns were dramatically better than people that didn't. And so, if you have the capital and are looking at a way, shareholder dividends shareholder dividends are being reduced, shareholder buybacks are being reduced. If you have capital, interest rates are low, this is an incredible time to be an acquirer of businesses. I would argue this is maybe one of the greatest wealth creation opportunities of our lifetimes in the next 12 to 18 months, which again gets to making sure if you're a seller that you're picking a partner, whether it's a private equity group or a strategic or somebody or some other structure, even an IPO, where you can grow and create wealth for yourself. So there are a lot of acquirers that we're talking to that are saying, you know what, we have a very strong business right now. This is the time for us to be very, very acquisitive, and we're willing to pay premium multiples for that opportunity. So I think it's a little bit of a tale of two sides, in that, again, there are a number, unfortunately, of clients that are really struggling and kind of have to do M&A because they don't really have another choice. There's no capital available, and otherwise they're going to be restructured or go into distress or bankruptcy. But then again, there's this really great pot of people that are taking this as an opportunity to really grow and be successful.
Yeah, well, actually, those are two really good points. Let me comment on both of them. On the sort of defensive side, if you find yourself in the unfortunate position of needing to do something, whether it's because of COVID or any other reason, I personally think when you go out to buyers, whether it's private equity or whomever it is, leveling with them early is definitely the right strategy. If I have a meeting with someone who's trying to sell their business today and it's in the middle of coronavirus and they give me a lot of hoo-ha about why, well, it's a good time and a bunch of other BS, I'm going to spend a lot of time not believing that and trying to figure out the real reason is. And, whoever that person is talking to me immediately loses credibility, and it's hard to get that back. On the other hand, if you level with someone and say, listen, we have to sell now because we have this problem, or we were close before and now coronavirus, you level with them. And by the way, you level with 5 or 6 other people. You can actually create some real competition and probably end up with a better price than if you trying to sort of hide the ball a little bit, of the 5 or 6 people, 4 of them say, forget it, I don't want to do business with this person. and now you're stuck with a much tougher situation. On the offensive side, I have to say that of all the deals we look at, all the types of deals we look at, there is nothing we like more than company A comes to us and says, we want to buy company B. We've been following them for 20 years. We know everything about them. They're in real trouble now. We're not doing great either, but we're doing a lot better than them for the following reasons. And we need a capital provider here. Would you do it with us? And we'll collectively own the combined company or whatever the structure is. Those are my favorite kind of deals, because there's no way I can learn in a 2 or 3 month diligence process or whatever it is as much about that business as someone who's been a competitor for many years and who knows the business way better, knows the competitive dynamic and what they're selling or what they're buying or whatever. There's just no comparison, and that's a much better way to do it. And once we get those interests aligned up front, which is always the trick, it's always the hard part. But once you do that is my favorite kind of deal, because now I have a real expert working with me rather than me trying to be an expert in a very short period of time.
Just 2 other things on the offensive side, which are interesting subpoints, Juliet. I'd just like to add. There's 2 things that have emerged recently, which on the buyer side, which we haven't really seen before. One is people trying to make acquisitions to diversify supply chain. Like I said earlier, a lot of companies had pretty concentrated supply chains, whether it's Asia or otherwise. And we're seeing acquirers now come to us and say, I could build alternative supply chain opportunities, in Mexico and Central America or wherever, but I'd rather buy them. And so there's a lot of that. And then the other thing, which is interesting, and it's especially interesting given the unemployment, is acquirers looking to buy companies for their talent. If you go back to January, talent was the hardest thing for every company that we were working with, trying to recruit, retain, mentor, develop talent. This has been unusual, obviously, with the unemployment over the last few months. But I think, once we get back to some level of normalcy, I think that war for talent is going to continue. And so a lot of buyers are buying businesses, not just for the cash flows, but for the quality of the management, the quality of the team. And I think that's going to continue. And so I think as a seller, if you have a good team of really high quality people that are respected in their industry and are viewed as innovators, I think you could still get some really good interest from potential buyers.
I want to go to, there's a few more questions, so I want to make sure we get to some. Chris, Rich, let's go to you, because you're in Atlanta, private business owner in the security space, and I think you've got an interesting question around impacts to certain industries as a result of the sort of defunding movement.
Yeah, so I was just curious, do you guys have any thoughts around that? With the defunding of police that's going on nationally, and you see different cities, colleges, businesses are really transitioning from off-duty police officers to private security. So I was curious if you thought it was going to be a bigger boom because we're seeing it.
Yeah, so there's a whole, macro point. There's a lot of there's going to be a lot of interesting transitions around businesses that have relied on some kind of government funding. I think education is going to be, there's going to be a lot of impact on education. I think, and I'll come back to your question specifically in a minute, Chris, but, companies that do virtual education are benefiting, companies or schools that do physical education are struggling. So, that's one industry that has historically relied on government funding that's now flipping it to private funding, and there's a lot of transition there. But I think your question is absolutely right. I think right now, government funding and spending is definitely at risk and under stress. And so we're seeing in the government side, specifically around security, alarm monitoring, alarm maintenance, physical security, cybersecurity. We're seeing companies that have the ability to attract private funding, especially in the corporate world, are getting a lot of interest. Whereas, companies that rely on government-oriented personnel, government-oriented funding, I wouldn't say they're struggling, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty around them. And I think that's, uncertainty is my worst nightmare. Like, I hate uncertainty. I like stability. I like predictability. I like forecastability. So, working in a situation that has a lot of uncertainty is always tricky, because at the end of the day, we're trying to give our clients advice on valuation, advice on certainty of closing. And when there's big turbulence in funding models or big turbulence in financing, that that reduces our ability to give good advice.
Thanks, Chris. And I also want to go to Scott Parker, who had a question around around mid-market financing. Scott, are you there?
Yes, I am. Yes.
What's your question, Scott, and who's it for?
Okay, so this is I'm the CFO of a privately held company. We're actually in the late stages of an acquisition opportunity, and the financing component of the deal, has all of a sudden become somewhat more challenging than it was before. And I'm just curious to get some color around, and we're kind of talking primarily to our long-term banking partner. We haven't gone out and shopped it. So I'm just kind of curious about maybe, is that typical? The deals have gotten much harder to finance, pricing's gone up, or maybe am I getting a little bit of a shaded view?
No, let me take that. I definitely think deals have gotten harder to finance. I think that what we keep hearing on the sort of deal financing side is that repeat issuers who are either coming back to refinance or there's some sort of acquisition where the debt markets already know that particular issuer well, they're getting done like no problem. But anything new or different, anything that has a story attached to it, anything that's not right off the shelf from the debt markets, I think are definitely having troubles. And I think the bankers are doing a fair amount of tap dancing right now to try to sort of keep their clients warm and show confidence, but also deal with the issue that the debt markets are definitely very quirky right now. I keep hearing that the high yield market, so big issuers that will do bonds, are having a lot easier time than smaller issuers doing bank debt. When you look at the difference from the bond market and the bank debt market as far as issuance and volumes, it's sort of crazy. There's a few theories behind that. At least one theory is that the U.S. government is busy buying equity and busy buying bonds, but they're not buying bank debt. So I'm not saying they're buying every bond, but just buying some, put some real gas behind one market, but not another. So I got to say, Scott, what you're living through right now sounds like exactly what I'm living through on a couple things right now, and I think it's somewhat unclear. And not to make you feel any worse, but what a banker tells you on a Monday, which might be the truth, by the way, might be what they really know and what they really believe, could easily change by Thursday. And can change back by the following Tuesday. We've seen a lot of that.
Yeah, and I just add a few things. I mean, I think I totally agree. The banks themselves, commercial banks, that what most of us think of as a bank, got so underwater with the PPP process that it sort of took their eye off of new lending, and they were focused on existing clients, which is fine. Our team is saying that compared today to whatever you want to say, normal or January, pricing has gone up, depends on the situation, but somewhere between, around 300 basis points in terms of leverage financing. Capacity has gone down by, half a turn of EBITDA to a full turn of EBITDA. But I think, like David said, I mean, a lot of banks, lenders are just shut down. They're focused on their own portfolio. They're not even looking at new opportunities. So Scott, I mean, not to paint too bleak a picture, but, I do think they're financing out there, but I think you have to be more creative than probably you would like to be, and be prepared for enhanced cost, at least for the time being.
Yeah, on cost, I got to say, sometimes debt people that lenders or people in the debt markets, react different around cost than borrowers do. In other words, you might be more than happy to pay an extra 25 or 50 basis points to have that certainty. And people who live in the debt markets every day sometimes get worried about even suggesting that because it's such an insanely high amount of money. You would yell and scream and lose your mind. Where in reality you'd say, yeah, 50 basis points, what the hell? I'll be able to sleep tonight. So, I think right now, especially when it comes to sort of leverage finance outside of some very big companies, paying a little more for more certainty is well worth doing, especially if it's refinanceable and prepayable and you can clean it up in a year or two, or even 6 months.
And as we've got to wrap this up in a sec, but as the workforce and global landscape changes, what concrete steps should businesses be taking to remain competitive and succeed? Phil, how would you, what advice would you give there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think the first one, like I said earlier, is definitely make sure you've thought through diversifying your supply chain if that's important. I think really, a lot of business comes, and the value of business comes down to management. And so I think making sure that your team is, especially in these kinds of times where it's really hard to find ways to engage your team, find opportunities to try to get people together if you can, obviously within regulations or virtually, really making sure the team is engaged, because that's really going to drive a lot of your success going forward. So I think that's, and staying in touch with clients. I think, to David's point earlier about how in 2009 it was, everyone was against the banks. This thing really doesn't have an enemy. And so we found that our clients' customers are being much more collaborative, much more sort of partner driven than they ever have been. And I think you as business owners should take them up on that and make sure that you're treating them as partners, that they're treating you as partners, because I think that's going to pay massive dividends in the long run. And then the last thing, again, I've sort of referenced this, but is trying to use this time to, if you're interested in M&A, to think about how to forecast your business, how to prepare for a potential process, get ready for this, build the infrastructure, whether it's finance or, but everyone's under the gun right now. It's a hard time, even for businesses that are doing well. Not being able to forecast a business doesn't always mean it's bad. Sometimes it's hard to forecast a business that's doing really well. And again, that's one of the things we do, I think, pretty well, is help businesses think through that.
And David, what are the biggest changes you think we should expect for both buyers and sellers in a post-pandemic world?
In the world I focus in, which is financial services, again, it hasn't taken sort of the direct hit from this crisis, but there's been sort of all sorts of ancillary and derivative hits, like people that count on financing markets to in their business. Some financing market that has nothing to do with healthcare or COVID or whatever, New York City or whatever, dries up overnight, and no one knows why. But all of a sudden, good companies are facing serious problems. I think it's always a good advice, but this is a good time to refresh our memories that diversifying your financing sources, even paying a little more for that than you think you should, is probably money well spent. Warren Buffett says, you should never count on the charitable nature of strangers. We've seen a number of good businesses that have perfectly reasonable business strategies have some serious problems over the last few months because some quirky thing they count on from financing sources disappeared for a short period of time, and they couldn't live through that short period of time. David
and Phil, thank you so much for such an insightful dialogue on thriving in this new business landscape. It's been incredibly informative, and a special thank you to Deloitte Private for being a great partner and sponsor for this series. Most importantly, thank you for all of you that joined us today and for your great questions. I hope you found it useful. Please do share any feedback with us. We'd love to hear your comments and other topics you'd like us to cover in this series. You can email us at community@worth.com, and look out for the next installment of this series, which we'll share with you in the coming weeks. Tomorrow in the next normal series, which is another series Worth does, we're joined by special guest Roger Dow, President and CEO of the US Travel Association, Neil Jacobs, CEO of Six Senses Hotel Resorts and Spas, and CEO of Visit Barbados, Robert Chase. We're going to be talking about the future of the travel and tourism industry, and we're doing a number of events in that series as well. So please register online, worth.com/events for all of our events, as well as sign up for our weekly business and investing newsletter. In the meantime, be well, stay safe, healthy, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again very much, Phil and David, for speaking today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Juliet. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.